Kyle Anslone Show, and joining me today is Dave DeCamp, my colleague at antiwar.com, where he is the news editor and just, I mean, covering things so well and really just stripping out all the mainstream bias and all the foreign policy news that you need and just giving you the straight facts. So, Dave, welcome back to the show. You're an audience favorite. You're a favorite of mine, and happy to have you here today. How you doing?
I'm good. Thanks for having me. Happy to be back.
Well, Dave, I got quite a bit I want to ask you about. I hope we got time to go through it all. Is Trump sending more weapons to Ukraine? Sergei Lavrov's trip to Korea? Marjorie Taylor Greene has some really interesting statements on Israel's nuclear weapons and an American killed in Israel. So, Dave, let's start off here with more weapons going to Ukraine and play this clip of Lindsey Graham yesterday on Face the Nation.
I expect in the coming days you will see weapons flowing at a record level to help Ukraine defend themselves. I expect in the coming days that there will be tariffs and sanctions available to President Trump he's never had before. I expect in the coming days more support from Europe regarding their efforts to help Ukraine. Putin made a miscalculation here. For 6 months, President Trump tried to entice Putin to the table. The attacks have gone up, not down. One of the biggest miscalculations Putin has made is to play Trump. And you just watch. In the coming days and weeks, there's going to be a massive effort to get Putin to the table. And to those who are helping him, China buying cheap Russian oil and having no accountability, those days are about over.
So, Dave, there's so much here, but I want to start with this point first, which is more weapons shipments to Ukraine. Do you think Lindsey Graham's right? I think Trump has already approved, or at least said he approved, shipment of Patriot missiles to Ukraine. But do you think, as Graham's talking about, we're going to start to see massive U.S. arms shipments going to Ukraine?
Yeah, I think he might be right. Today, Trump met with the head of NATO, Mark Rutte, and they announced this new plan where the U.S., they're saying that NATO countries are going to buy a whole bunch of weapons from the U.S. for the purpose of sending them to Ukraine. And according to a report from Axios, the first wave of weapon shipments is going to be something like $10 billion worth of arms deals that are expected to go through. And then the idea is to either send those weapons right into Ukraine, or if these countries that are purchasing them, already have these types of weapons, and they're going to send what they have and then replace what they send to Ukraine with what they're buying from the US. Trump and Rutte are saying that all these countries are, Germany and all the major European countries are on board with this plan. And based on the rhetoric from most of these European leaders, it does seem like they're ready to just double down on the proxy war, dump more weapons in there and keep this thing going. So unfortunately, it does seem like there's a chance here that Lindsey Graham is going to get his way and that he's in Trump's ear. And Trump seems to have, based on what he said today, he's saying if Russia doesn't agree to a deal within 50 days, we're going to impose these tariffs on Russia. Trump seems to be saying that he's ready to just kind of let this thing go on and increase all the military aid. The way that he's framing it is, we're not going to be spending the money. That way he could try to sell it to his base, to the people who he promised that he would end this war within a day of coming into office. Obviously, that hasn't happened, and the war continues. And it just seems like Trump's, again, this is kind of his whole big thing. The Europeans have to pay. He got this commitment from NATO countries to spend 5% of their GDP on their military. But the wars continue, the conflict continues, and it's just not going in a good direction.
That's two questions for you, Dave. The first is the U.S. has $3.8 billion, as far as I've read, left in funds for U.S. weapons that we could transfer to Ukraine. And so when you use that 10 billion number, is a portion of that the U.S. funds? I know Lindsey Graham in this Face the Nation interview hinted at using seized Russian assets to pay for some of this. Or is it the Europeans buying the weapons that's going to make up the bulk of this?
As far as from what I've gathered today, that appears to be talking about what the Europeans are going to be buying from the U.S. to send into Ukraine. And now we also have seen these reports that Trump's getting ready to approve additional U.S. military aid for Ukraine using that 3 point something billion that's left over from Biden. I expected him to announce that today, but we didn't see that, so not clear what's going to happen with that. But yeah, this seems to be the name of the game now, is to just dump more weapons into Ukraine and keep this war going.
Another aspect of what Lindsey Graham is talking about there isn't just the weapons transfers, but it's new sanctions on Russia. And this is something that the senator has been giddy about for some time now. He actually has an unbelievable 85 co-sponsors on this bill that would place 500% sanctions or tariffs on any country that does business with Russia. And so
Oh, looks like we lost Kyle. So what Kyle was asking me about this bill, and it is really crazy. So the number is up to 85. 85 out of 100 senators have co-sponsored a bill to put 500% tariffs on Russia's trading partners, and that means China and India. And so the fact that 85 senators have signed up for something, I mean, this stupid, the idea that you could put 500% tariffs on China, it's just really absurd. But this is the attitude in DC. And unfortunately, it seems like Trump, is kind of starting to warm up to this idea. I don't think there's any situation where we're going to see 500% tariffs on all of Russia's trading partners. But, Trump was saying, he was throwing numbers out, as we discussed before we started recording, that he might put 100% tariffs on, but he also mentioned the 500% number. So the fact is that, he's moving in this direction. And this is all very unfortunate, because one thing I was hoping for with Trump was that I knew he was going to support Israel's genocide in Gaza. I was hoping that the proxy war would be over, but this continues. So it looks like I lost Kyle. Not sure when he's going to come back, but I guess I could continue on here by myself. Is there what were we going to shift to here, Chris? I know. I mean, again, I think the big takeaway from Ukraine is that Trump is making some serious commitments to send weapons and threatening sanctions, which is essentially doubling down on Biden's policy. This is a continuation of Joe Biden: sanctions and weapons, and he might be sending the weapons. Okay, yeah. So I mean, I'm wrapping up with this now. That this is essentially just continuation of the Biden administration. What a President Harris might have done as well. All right, what do you got next
There's
here?
going to be an announcement coming relevant or relating to Russia on Monday. Can you tell us a little bit about what his thinking is based on your conversation last night, where things currently stand?
No. I mean, that's what Monday will be about.
What about, he did say that there's a new agreement between the U.S. and NATO to get new U.S. weaponry through NATO to Ukraine, and NATO is going to fully pay for that, according to the president. Can you explain to us exactly, number one, how that's going to work, and when those weapons, as part of this agreement, will actually get to Ukraine?
Well, I think what you're referring to is something that Ukraine has already offered, and so has Europe, and that is to buy weapons from the United States and then provide them to Ukraine. At the end of the day, that some of the systems that Ukraine requires are systems that Europe doesn't make. They would have to purchase them from the United States. In addition to that, I would point to the fact that a number of the defensive weapons that Ukraine seeks, our allies in NATO have them. So as an example, Germany, I believe, has 13 or 14 Patriot batteries. Other countries do as well, Spain, others, and some have placed orders for that. And so we've continued to encourage our NATO allies to provide those weapons, systems, those defensive systems that Ukraine seeks, that they should provide those weapons to Ukraine since they have them in their stocks. And then we can enter into financial agreements with us where they can purchase the replacements.
So these are existing.
All right. So I am very lucky to have a real professional like Dave DeCamp as my guest today that was able to just jump in and fill for me there. Now, Dave, to get back into the interview here with that Rubio clip, the real question I want to ask you is at the beginning of July, the Pentagon was telling us that The problem is we simply don't have enough of these munitions, and that's actually something that Marco Rubio has said. Now Trump's saying that it's okay, Europe is going to pay for them, which these seem to be two separate problems, right? Which we logistically just simply don't have enough in our stockpiles versus who's paying for these weapon systems. And do you see that similar problem with this policy?
Yeah, I think that's definitely a problem that they're going to run into here, because as what just happened last week or 2 weeks ago, that there was a review of Pentagon stockpiles, and someone in the Pentagon decided to halt certain weapon shipments to Ukraine because of that review. Really, the main thing being the Patriot missile interceptors and everything, and that's one reason why I think we see Trump. He said during the press conference with Ruta, I don't think he named the country. It was kind of vague, but he said, "Oh, there's a certain country that's ordered, 16 or however many Patriot batteries and interceptors, and they don't really need them, so they should just send them to Ukraine." So they're finding different ways to send certain things. But I think when it comes to like the long term feasibility of this policy, it's certainly gonna they could run into a problem there with the stockpile levels.
A few years ago, the Taiwanese were upset that I think it was like 2028 or 2029, they would have to wait to get their Patriot Path 3 missiles that they had ordered. And who knows, by then they'll probably have an upgraded version of the Patriot. But it just seems like, there's simply not enough of these interceptors to go around in the West. And, do you think that this war, you would have hoped that Donald Trump's kind of American first principles, where, principles is a hard word to use with Trump, would have helped us to get out of the war? That's what he promised on the campaign trail. But now it seems like maybe what's going to get us out of this war is just we don't have enough weapons. Like at some point, there's nothing to send the Ukrainians, and at which point Russia is going to win this conflict. And I guess of all the ways it could end, do you think that might be a possible outcome, Dave?
I mean, potentially. The thing is, though, is that it doesn't seem like the U.S. or Europe don't care about Ukrainian losses,
Right.
and Zelensky seems ready to just keep this war going as long as he could stay in power. So I could see this really being dragged out for a long time, and the U.S. and NATO kind of trying to increase their capacity to manufacture things. So I would see that could be something that the lack of certain munitions could be something that will lead to the decision in the U.S. and NATO to end this proxy war. But I don't see this like dragging out to the point where they just run out of weapons. Um, but the way things are looking now, I mean, essentially, Russia's made it clear this war is not going to end until Ukraine agrees to its demands territorially and the neutrality. And that's not going to happen until Zelensky loses the support from the U.S. and NATO and is basically made to negotiate. So it's unfortunate, but I mean, I just see this going on for years now, unless there's like a radical change.
Right, or just like a radical collapse in the Ukrainian military if they can't continue to fill out the ranks or something like that. Dave, the Russian foreign minister, Sergei Lavrov, was in North Korea, and he made some interesting comments dealing with the war in Ukraine and the North Korean soldiers' involvement. So, Chris, let's play this next clip.
We are sincerely grateful to the leadership of the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, all military personnel, soldiers, and officers who demonstrated excellent combat training and made a very important contribution to the just cause of liberating Russian territories.
So, Dave, I thought this was an important statement. I know a couple months ago, the North Koreans came out and were really celebrating how much they had helped the Russians in Kursk. But to have Sergei Lavrov come to Pyongyang, acknowledge that in a meeting with Kim, it seems to be a real mission here that not only is this North Korean and Russian relationship like very serious, but also almost a mutual defense pact.
Yeah, no, I mean they are really demonstrating that this is a real military alliance that they're building here, and it's concerning because we see kind of these blocks forming with just everything that's happening in these different parts of the world. We see reports of China sending air defenses to Iran after the U.S.-Israeli war against Iran. But yeah, this North Korea Russia thing, I mean, and this is kind of a natural development, considering both countries are under a lot of sanctions from the West. Um, but yeah, it's a big development, this whole military relationship between them.
Another clip here because you know, as much as a lot of the focus of this relationship has been on Russia's west with the war in Ukraine, it's Lavrov, not Kim Jong-un, that's also pointing out how this relationship is developing in Russia's far east. So let's play this next clip.
Military construction is underway around this country with the participation of the USA, South Korea, Japan. We warn against exploiting these ties to build alliances directed against anyone, including North Korea and, of course, Russia.
So, Dave, I thought this was important that Lavrov, again, not only going to Pyongyang, not only celebrating what the North Koreans did in Russia, but also talking about how Russia is concerned about the U.S. and kind of what they call Asia NATO expansion going on in the Indo-Pacific. And so, what are your thoughts on kind of this shift where you are seeing Russia, China, North Korea increasingly, I guess, at least seeing a large mutual foe in the United States and our allied states in the region?
Yeah, well, I mean, again, they're both facing very similar pressure, and we see
Mhm.
the U.S. undertaking this big military buildup now in the Asia Pacific. I mean, obviously, there's always been tensions on the Korean Peninsula, but one thing that we've seen really develop over the past few years is kind of this alliance building with Japan, Australia, the Philippines, South Korea. They want to get in on it as well, and they are. You know, we've seen some officials actually call it an Asian NATO. So it's just, you know, there's clear lines being drawn if all of these different hotspots do turn into World War III, and really it is, you know, pretty terrifying to think about that.
Be one of the things with Lindsey Graham's bill that may really blow up in the US's face, right? Where if you're going to slap 500% across the board tariffs on India, Brazil, maybe even Turkey, China, Iran, all these states that are going to continue to do business with Russia, it seems that to me like really Brits ever becoming a military pad to rival the United States or something like always seemed like a real fantasy to me, Dave. But it seems like the warhawks are essentially you know, in a self-fulfilling prophecy kind of way, creating the own nightmare scenario in the world which they imagined, where they make an enemy out of every single one of these countries, and they all shrug their shoulders and say, well, our all of our biggest problems is the United States of America, and so now we all have to have some kind of very mutual defense kind of at least somewhat NATO countering block in order to have the, you know, ability to resist the United States, because on our own, sure, the United States could isolate any one of these countries, but when Iran continues to trade with China, when North Korea has Russia as an outlet, when Venezuela has Cuba and Iran as outlets, then all of these states could continue to exist with, even under intense U.S. pressure. So your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I find it really hard to believe that they're going to really go through with these 500% tariffs on all these countries, because, as you see, you know, a few that you mentioned there, like Turkey, Brazil. I mean, it's just this is not a realistic plan that they're proposing. But I mean, it really does go to show, like, this, that the fact that this is their attitude, I think, in general, is just very concerning. And it's been obvious for a long time that all these sanctions and just this approach to the world would create the big enemy that they've, you know, that they say that they're afraid of, you know, Russia, China, and the BRICS countries that could actually get involved in some sort of uh, military alliance. And I think one thing to keep a close eye on is Iran and Russia after this war. How much support are we going to see come from Russia, come from China? You know, because I think that could give us a good idea of what a real military, you know, axis, whatever nickname they'll think up for it, might look like.
Iran was, I believe, trying to buy air defense systems from China using the profits from oil sales. So that was interesting, although Beijing did give an official denial to that report. But I would imagine that even if Russia, say, doesn't have the surplus military equipment at this point to send it to Iran, that Beijing would be willing to send them some military aid, in part just to make sure that the Islamic Republic doesn't fall and that the U.S. and Israel don't roll out another regime change operation here in a couple months. Now, speaking of Israel, Dave, we had one congresswoman make an incredible statement on the state of Israel, and I couldn't believe this is what Marjorie Taylor Greene said to Steve Bannon. Let's play the clip.
I'm entering amendments to strike $500 million more dollars for nuclear armed Israel. And it's important to say nuclear armed Israel because they do have nuclear weapons. This is not a helpless country. And we already give them $3.4 billion every single year in the state from the State Department, $3.4 billion every single year. They don't need another $500 million in our defense budget. That's for the American people's defense. That's for the defense of the United States of America and our borders. Israel, you can nuclear armed Israel. I think it's really important to phrase it that way. Nuclear armed Israel doesn't need $500 more million from the American people. Our government just bombed Iran on their behalf and destroyed Iran's nuclear problem. So I'm entering an amendment to strike $500 million more dollars for nuclear armed Israel.
Dave, I mean, it's always great to hear a member of Congress acknowledge that Israel has nuclear weapons and that Marjorie Taylor Greene has taken some action to cut military aid to Israel. I mean, she's really going after one of the projects in Washington that you're just not allowed to go after. And I think this is incredibly brave and a great statement for a congresswoman to make. So what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, it's good because it opens it up for other members of Congress to be asked about this. And it really is like the most explicit. I asked Sam Husseini because I know this is something he asks U.S. government officials about a lot, is Israel's nuclear weapons. And, essentially, at least in recent times, in recent decades, it's the most explicit acknowledgement from a member of Congress of Israel's nuclear weapons. And I also like how she said that the U.S. bombed Iran on behalf of Israel. And, she hasn't played into this whole claim that Iran was some kind of threat. She was putting out these very long posts on X throughout that war, against coming out against it. So I think, just the fact, if even that enters the conversation more, you think about the propaganda effect. There's all this fear mongering about Iran's nuclear weapons program, which doesn't exist. And nobody ever, the context that Israel's actually armed with nuclear weapons is never part of the conversation, because the idea is, if Iran develops a nuclear weapon, they're just going to be able to, just drop it on Israel right away. But the fact that Israel has a nuclear deterrent isn't ever mentioned as part of that conversation. So I think it's important to kind of just get out there. And again, it opens up the question for other members of Congress. You could say Marjorie Taylor Greene acknowledged this reality. Why can't you? So hopefully we see more.
Yeah. And Dave, I wanted to ask you a question about this. So she's specifically targeting $500 million in American security assistance to Israel. But that isn't all the security assistance that we give Israel every year, right?
No, it's not. She's talking about...
Go through and break it down for us.
Yeah, so that's the $500 million in missile defense that goes through the Pentagon. Each year, under a memorandum of understanding that the Obama administration signed with Israel, the U.S. gives Israel $3.8 billion. So you have $500 million in missile defense, and then $3.3 billion in what they call foreign military financing, and that is a State Department program that gives foreign governments money to purchase U.S. weapons. That also funds things like military construction in Israel. And since October 7th, the U.S. has approved a whole bunch more. I don't know the exact numbers off the top of my head, but I forget when Biden signed this big $95 billion foreign military aid bill, there was about another $14 billion or so there for Israel for specifically military aid. And then, of course, there's other types of support, especially with this Iran war. According to estimates, the U.S. spent at least 1.25 billion just in THAAD interceptors, trying to shoot down Iranian missiles. But they were also using warships, fighter jets to intercept missiles, and then of course bombing run in Iran, and then the Patriot missiles and the defense of the U.S. base in Qatar. So it's big money that the U.S. uses to support Israel.
They use like maybe 20% of the total world supply of the THAAD interceptors to defend Israel there. So this is, of course, going to take years to replenish the Patriots that we use, years to replenish billions of dollars. And so, and I'm sure the U.S. probably spent just $20 billion in, or not 20, but $1 billion in logistics alone, removing and moving all these different military assets around the Middle East in the lead up and during Israel's war. We evacuated, moved all the aircraft from the Al Udeid Air Base in Qatar to an air base in Saudi Arabia. Flying these planes isn't easy. It's not cheap. Moving the troops around, same thing. Sailing aircraft carriers to the Middle East, back from the Middle East. All these deployments are very, very expensive. And so, more money. The war against Ansar Allah, the Houthis in Yemen, more money. And so it seems like the funding and what Congress is willing to give Israel is almost bottomless. And it's very interesting, Dave, that you have Marjorie Taylor Greene, who going into the 2024, election season and into the Trump presidency, I would just assume would have been one, the congresswoman that is just on board with whatever America first and what Trump says. But she has been, along with Thomas Massey, essentially the only Republicans willing to break rank here and kind of stand up to the just pro-Israel narrative that dominates the Republican Party. So have you been surprised to hear this from Marjorie Taylor Greene?
Yeah. Not too surprised though, because I've seen. I feel like we saw similar things from her over the years, where she would kind of go against the grain in a way that other Republicans wouldn't. But it's good to see. We need much more of it on the Republican side. So hopefully, and as I'm aware, and I'm sure you're aware, younger people involved in the Republican Party at lower levels and even in government are much more skeptical of the U.S.-Israel relationship. So I think the future, we're going to see more comments like Marjorie Taylor Greene's from Republicans, but it's going to take some time.
Well, yeah, and it seems to me, Dave, that like the under 50 Republican crowd are increasingly, at least, against the special relationship between the U.S. and Israel. And I also think the best users of social media, they're the best at making memes, spreading messages, getting people to like care about and jump on board with causes, kind of getting different videos and trends to pick up steam and go viral. And so I really do think that block of people is increasingly a problem for the Israel lobby. And I do think, you're right that Marjorie Taylor Greene, I think, is one of the Republican congressmen that is more interested in the younger Republican vote than the typical, retiree Republican vote that a lot of Republicans rely on, which is, of course, very pro-Israel. Now, one of the things that I would really hope would turn Republicans, at least against, again, the special relationship with Israel, is the fact that Israel keeps killing Americans. And, I know you're covering this at antiwar.com, that there was an American killed over the weekend by Israeli settlers. Settlers set fire to a church in the West Bank. So I guess just talk about a little bit like the destruction and the rampage the IDF, and even more so, Israeli settlers have been on targeting Americans and Christians in the West Bank.
Yeah, I mean, both, there's been a real spike in Israeli settler violence and Israeli military operations in the West Bank over the past I can't believe it's almost 2 years since October 7th. But we've seen, it seems like even more of an increase in the settler violence just in recent months. And that's potentially because they are emboldened by this new Trump administration, which is openly in support of settlements. You got a guy like Mike Huckabee, who's the U.S. ambassador to Israel. And we've just seen an increase in settler attacks. And what happens is they go to these villages, they light cars on fire, they threaten people, tell them that they're going to kill them. And what they're trying to do is drive people out of the villages so they could take over their land. And in some villages, they've they've been successful. And this recent incident on Friday, it was one of these villages that was coming under increasing settler attacks. And an American named Saifola Musalet, known as Saif to his friends and family, he was visiting family at a nearby village. He's from Tampa, Florida, born and raised, was in the West Bank just visiting. And he went to the village as part of a gathering, kind of what they've been doing to draw attention to the settler violence and, kind of protection, from the attacks. And this gathering was attacked, and it ended with him being beaten to death. And again, this is an American, and it's really gotten barely any media coverage. And I didn't check today to see if the State Department said anything at their press briefing, or I'm sure they were asked about it. But over the weekend, when they were asked about it, their comment was, "Oh yeah, we can confirm that an American citizen was killed, but any questions, about a investigation, we direct you to the Israeli government," which is just so absurd. And we've also seen an increase in attacks against Christians, specifically the village of Taiba, which is the last village in the West Bank that is 100% populated by Christians. Settlers last week set fire near an ancient church that was built in the 5th century. And just today, church leaders from Jerusalem went there, and diplomats from all different countries, the UK, France, China, Russia, also visited, because the priests in the town were calling for help and attention to their plight. But notably missing, as far as I could see from the visit, was any American official. And Mike Huckabee has stayed silent on these attacks against the Christian village. But yeah, things like this, when it comes to flipping the narrative on the Republican, on the conservative side in the U.S., more and more people seem to be aware of what the U.S. is actually supporting, because these settlers are completely backed by the military. In a lot of cases, they'll attack Palestinians, and if Palestinians choose to defend themselves, then the military comes in, and in some cases they come in shooting and they kill people. And it's just becoming much more clear what U.S. military aid to Israel is actually supporting.
Yeah. Dave, you've been doing a good job of covering the horrors in the West Bank over these, past 21 months. Israel has turned it into like a free fire zone and has killed children playing in the dirt, little girls sitting at their dinner tables. Multiple Americans now since October 7th in the West Bank. There was also a young Turkish American girl that was killed there. They abducted the hospital director from a hospital in Gaza and have now tortured him, and his lawyer saying that he's in critical condition and needs medical assistance. On Sunday for antiwar.com, or maybe late last week, you wrote an article explaining that 10 children who are waiting for nutritional supplements were killed in Gaza by an Israeli airstrike. I know I wrote one yesterday at judgenap.com on 6 children who were killed waiting for water in Gaza. And it just seems like, Dave, something like any one of these headlines, any one of these stories should be enough that somebody reads it and their immediate reaction is, we have to cut off Israel. We can no longer be a part of this. And yet you've written these articles almost one every day for 600 and something days as we've watched this war go on. And so do you think we're any closer to kind of getting to that breaking point where there's going to be a critical mass of Americans who stand up and say, we just don't want to do this anymore, cut off Israel?
No, I don't think so, unfortunately. Like I said, I do think that things are changing, but ultimately this goes on every day. I mean, over 100 Palestinians are getting killed that's been the daily death toll now for like a week. And we're seeing Palestinians getting slaughtered. And I mean, the aid site massacres, as you said, it's just like any single one of these stories should be enough to stop. But we're not really seeing any kind of national movement. I mean, we see a lot of people angry about it. The Democrats don't even seem to care. I thought that we would get more opposition from them, since now it's become, Trump's in charge now. But it almost seems like that's gone away. I mean, if you remember under Biden, there was all this stuff about how U.S. aid to Israel violates foreign assistance laws because they're blocking aid deliveries. And those efforts seem to have, the Democrats are just focused on other things. And the only thing, I mean, really the only thing we could hope for is some kind of change in Trump, that there's enough pressure on him, or he decides for whatever reason to make that call and tell Netanyahu, it's over, make the deal, because we see Netanyahu figuring out ways to make sure there's no ceasefire. And then if there is a ceasefire, it's only going to be temporary. Um, the unfortunate reality is that the only one who's got the power to stop this right now is Donald Trump. And it doesn't seem like he's willing to do that. And even like a mass uprising, I mean, maybe that could change things, but we're just not seeing that.
Yeah. Well, everybody, Dave DeCamp, news editor of Anti.
Did we lose?